Namaste, my good people. My name is Kathy Patton.
And my name is Reverend Odell Montgomery Cooper, and we are your hosts for Interruptions, Disrupting the Silence. We welcome you. We have 4 remaining podcasts left, and we are here to promote the upcoming online production called Interruptions, Disrupting the Silence, which now has a date to air on September 5th and 6th of 2020. Yes, yes. Our staff is rehearsing online in Zoom, and we're excited. However, during these podcasts, Kathy and I are going to have real talk with you. Real talk discussions that are raised and issues that are raised in the podcast that talk about interruptions that have disrupted our lives and probably yours. We are laughing, we're talking, we're being very transparent about who we are and what's going on in our life, and having some very good discussions. Last week, we even laughed at our gullibility on some things that we still believe that we were told when we were younger. However, the name of this podcast is very depictive of what happened in my life in 2016. My son Coop became another casualty of gun violence, and he was murdered by mistaken identity. Up until that time, my during that year, my family and I were happy. We were content, living a happy life. And as a mother, I could finally breathe, knowing that my children had finally discovered their niche in life. Until one day in April when he was murdered. And it began to unfold series of traumatic events in my life that we're going to talk about today and for the next upcoming podcast. And in the production covers 4 years of my life from the night my son was murdered until about last year. So you get a pretty good idea of what's been going on. Um, in these podcasts and in the production, I'm very transparent about talking about PTSD, depression, loss of job, detached from relationships, suicidal ideation, and addiction. And also, as a minister, I struggled with my faith and to try to understand and to cope with God's decision. So, in addition to all of that, on his birth date, a year later, I suffered a brain aneurysm. I'm not going to go into a lot of that this time, but you'll learn a lot about what happened when you see the production. And in the midst of healing, we get a pandemic. So, like everybody else, we're adjusting, we're pivoting, and we're dealing with another interruptions. And the purpose of the production and the podcast is I wanted to be transparent about what was going on in my life and to share that I finally learned to listen to my body, which most people we don't. We ignore the signs and the symptoms. So it's important for me to share my journey with you and how I finally broke the stigma of being silent, of inherited traditions. Don't air your dirty laundry. Keep everything to yourself.
Mhm.
Societal stigmas on mental health so that others can do the same.
And I shared the commonality of the fallout was what on my life was being interrupted when my child was diagnosed with autism. But before we get started, can you please press the like button, download and share this podcast because someone you know may need to hear this. In our last podcast, How Did I Get Here? Odell, as she shared a little bit about it, we shared how our life plans and journey were interrupted by two very different traumas, but nonetheless moved each of us off our intended roads we planned to travel. When we discussed how we were raised, church, our goals of college, love, successful jobs, and on and on. And just when we thought we could reach out and touch safety, our lives were interrupted and we ended up in very unfamiliar territory. And we had to ask ourselves, how did I get here?
How did I get here?
Today we have with us Miss Tamja Gray. Tamja is, hi Tam.
Hey,
Thank you for
Tam, how are you?
thank you for joining us. Tam is the lead clinical social worker for Yale New Haven Health Intensive Outpatient Psychiatry. So Tam, first of all, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Your job sounds like a lot of work wrapped into your title. And I know your client population is vast, especially this time during COVID-19. So many people dealing with trauma of having to stay in, dealing with loss of jobs and home, the uncertainty of the times that we're in and moving to and through. So, Tam, you viewed our last two podcasts, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And you heard Odell share the story, the tragic story of the murder of her son. So, just so you are aware, when we get questions about our podcast, we respond to them directly. So, some by email and some in personal conversations. But we always save one for the podcast. So, I'm really glad you're here for this question that I'm about to pose to Odell.
Ah,
So,
me, huh?
yes, it's going to you. It is
You're in
going
the
to
hot
you.
seat.
So, Odell, last week you were
Yes.
very, very honest about dealing with addiction through
Yes.
your journey of healing. And one viewer asked, as an ordained minister, aren't you embarrassed to speak about having drinks at happy hour versus relying on God and prayer to help you through the grief? Now, what do you say to someone that asks that question?
I'm first of all, I'm not surprised of that question. I've heard that question before. But to answer the first part of that question was I embarrassed? Answer
Mm,
is no. The purpose for me telling my story and the podcast and the production is to be transparent, to disrupt the silence of what we as people go through, regardless of our titles, but especially clergy, what we go through when we are sick or we have a disease. And I
Mm,
wanted to be transparent and tell this story, and so that others can hear and not have these misconceptions that because we're clergy, we're ordained, that we have some protective bubble with God, that we don't feel things. Um, I'm human.
mhm,
And being human, I am not exempt from catching a cold, getting a disease, having a sickness, grief, or trauma. So when my son was murdered, my body, and I know this 4 years later in terms of language, is my body was traumatized. And
mm,
my body responded to hearing the sudden news about my son, who I was just with 12 hours earlier, and then 12 hours later, he's murdered. Um, Hearing that news, my body automatically responded to PTSD. And you, I didn't know that. I'm grieving. And then there's still grief that I'm going through and shock. So going through all of these emotions and then trying to continue to live and figure out what happened and go
mhm,
through an investigation. Um, I started drinking. I had this hole in my heart and this pain that I could not numb.
mm,
And what I did was I started drinking, started going to
mhm.
happy hour. I didn't, there's no fun way to dress it up. I went to a local restaurant that I would frequently go to, but this time I'm sitting at the bar instead of sitting at a table. And you could tell I'm a fish out of water because people would look at me like, oh, you're at the bar. The Rev's at the bar.
Mm,
But I'm trying to numb the pain.
mhm,
And I kept drinking. I would do 3 nights a week. I'd have a maximum of 3 drinks, and that was my addiction. And I talk about it so that others would know that it's not may not be common for us to do it, but I was responding to my body, trying to numb some pain. So that's what I did. And it wasn't until I ended up in counseling that my counseling trauma specialist told me that the alcohol is exacerbating my depression
mhm,
and I needed to stop.
mm,
So I didn't know that one was triggering the other. And so that's what happened. Am I embarrassed? No. Am I talking about it? Yes, because I'm sure there are other clergy, other members out there of the cloth, regardless of their title, that are not exempt from being traumatized or being sick or getting
Mm-hmm.
a disease.
Mhm.
So, Tim, you heard Odell. Thank you, Odell, for sharing. I hit you with that question.
Yeah.
So I know it was difficult to respond to. So, Tim, you heard Odell's response. First of all, you heard the question, and then
Right.
you heard the response. And so, is this normal for Odell or anyone that has gone through that type of trauma to have dealt with it the way that she did? And then, secondly, do you see this in observations of people who have suffered such a tragedy?
Definitely. It is definitely probably one of the most common responses to trauma. Everyone will go through trauma and their response to it will be different. It depends on where they are in their lives. It depends on support systems. It depends on a lot of different factors. But yes, if most people will bring substances into it because that is a numbing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to feel. They don't want to the hurt, the pain. Who would want to feel those things? No one.
Right.
So we just want to, you know, lay, pass out, wake up, and go by our day. That's
Yes.
you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so yes, that's probably one of the most common responses. So
No, I'm sorry. So what type of populations do you work with, Tim, in
so
your daily job? So does it surround different types of trauma, especially the type of trauma that Odell went through?
yes, definitely. So we work with all diagnoses of major mental health and addiction. So we have clientele, patients who are from schizophrenic to bipolar, anxiety, depression, of course, trauma, PTSD, and then with some dually diagnosed as well. So they
Mm-hmm.
have all the dually diagnosed used some form of substance or addiction to get through what they're going through.
Yeah. So have you worked with mothers that have suffered such tragedy as Odell has?
Oh, yes. Over
Okay.
my 34 years, I have heard several stories similar to Odell's.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think it comes from a place for most of them of just, like you said, this interrupted path of this wasn't what I planned. How do I get through it? And just a process of healing.
Mm-hmm.
Tam, and you're working with mothers like me. Um, most of my complaints have come from people in the church.
Mm,
My prejudices, the stereotypes from folks in the church.
right.
Have you worked with the church population at all, pastors, clergy leaders?
It just so happens, yes, when I was a clinician at Connecticut Mental Health Center through Demas. I was on a task force with two other social workers, and we were given the task of going to local churches in New Haven. Some you probably heard of. Most
Don't
of them,
don't
they were
mention
all
their
black
Yeah.
names.
churches. No, no, no. All black churches in New Haven, and our task was to meet with the various ministers and reverends and bishops and whoever the head of the church was, and just talk to them about mental health and
Mm-hmm.
and what is going on with people when they come to them in this state of I don't know what to do. I don't know emotionally how to handle these things. And our job was to help them, lead them to us, to the clinicians, the treaters that can help them
Good.
through this. We get to a point with our clergy that, we have to tell people you just can't pray it away sometime.
No, it's that's I'm sure that was a very challenging meeting. I'm sure
With
there were more men in the room than women.
all men.
During my journey, I've had more people in the church accuse me of not praying more,
Mhm.
to pray more and to have more faith. I found those comments offensive and hurtful because God was with me. And God and I was talking every day. So it wasn't about faith, but I learned that, my faith played a role in my healing, but there were other attributes of mental health that I had to do differently.
That's right.
So yes.
So Tam, there was a point during Odell's healing. She decided to go back to work. I can't say that I agreed with it, but I think it was something that she needed to do to kind of move forward. And so during her visits to me, and this is after she went back to work, she would come over and then, sometimes she would just sit. She just needed to sit. It was a safe space for her. And I let her sit. And at one point, she held her head and she said, I should be better by now.
Mm.
And it made me so angry because I said to her, who is saying this to
Right,
you? Like,
right.
who you should be better. I mean, the fact that you're dressed and getting up and erect and found yourself over to my house is a miracle to me, because for
That's
me,
right.
going through that trauma, I know I probably would have still been rolled up in a ball somewhere in the corner of my room. But the fact that she had this pressure on herself to say, I should be better by now. So I mean, Odell, do you remember or going through that at
I
all?
do. I do remember because you brought it up last week. So you really were mad at me.
I was. I
Um,
was.
but it's
I was mad at whoever was saying that to you,
what
right?
happens is that
Yeah.
people don't want to know how you're doing while you're going through it. They just want you to get through it.
Yeah,
They want to know that you're okay on the other side. They
yeah.
want you to be able to tell the testimony. But what happens when everybody leaves and I'm going through this and still going through it? So people were saying you should be better. You shouldn't be
Mm.
crying every day. Every time I call you, you're still not feeling better. It's been a year. And I lost friends because they got tired of hearing I'm not better, and they wanted me to find the goodness in my day. And I couldn't find the goodness. They were like, well, God woke you up this morning and your daughter's healthy and your granddaughter's healthy, and you need to be thankful for that. And, hold on to that. To me, yes, but it wasn't enough.
Right, right.
It didn't take over the pain and the hole that I was feeling. To me, it wasn't enough. It was like God woke me up for another day just so that I could feel miserable.
Wow.
Um, so that's what happens. I bought into the hype. I bought
Mm.
into you're a strong black woman, you're going to get through this and you should be through this. And I started believing it until I stopped believing it.
Tim,
Yeah.
do you see
Yeah.
other patients put that type of pressure on themselves or other people? I shouldn't say that she was putting it on herself, because you heard her response that she started believing the hype. So what do you
Right.
see in that when other people are interrupting her journey? What do you see with that?
So most of the time when that happens, those are the people who are more uncomfortable with, not with you, but with themselves. They don't want to see you suffer or go through all the things you're going through. So they want you to stop. Just stop, because you're making me upset, and you are just, I need you to be the old Odell. That's who I want, the
Yes.
old Odell. And people do it all the time. I often in group will, if I have a patient who's tearful or crying, and there's someone passing them a box of tissue, I'm saying, no, that's your uncomfortableness with the tears. She needs to cry. She needs to go through this.
Yes. Hence why we called this podcast A Mother's Cry.
Yes.
Mhm.
We are during this journey, I cry. My son was murdered. I cry that he's not here. I cry because I have a memory or I don't have a memory. I cry because the pain is still there. What actually happened was after I had the brain aneurysm, I couldn't remember anything about my son.
Wow.
I would look at pictures and I could not remember where we were, what happened. And for a year, my daughter had to tell me a story about my son every day.
Mm.
And and when I look back on it, it was hard for her, but I couldn't remember. And she tells me now, you don't remember this. And, she'll tell me, and I'm like, oh, I remember that. That wasn't him. That was you. I may have had a brain aneurysm, but I haven't lost my faculties. And people ask me now when they listen to the podcast, they're like, I don't know how you're able to do this. I don't know how you're able to talk about your son week after week and do the planning. I just couldn't do it. And I'm not doing this by my strength. This is truly the grace of God. I believe that this is where God wants me to be. So I'm fulfilling the journey that God wants me to be on. But to get here is still a lot of work.
Mhm.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
it's a
Yeah.
process of healing.
It
It
takes
and it takes time to get there.
Yes.
Definitely.
And there are some who, I mean, we're at different places. There are
Right.
mothers like me who are at different stages, and there is no wrong place to be,
Nope.
and there's no right. And there are some mothers who I had someone say, well, my mother lost her son and she didn't go through what you did, so I don't understand why you can't function. Um,
Ooh.
yeah.
Hmm.
So yes.
So this is for both of you. More so for Tam. So you were all mothers, and so years ago, you remember that book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, right? Before
Oh.
you had, okay, right? And it was really clear from month 1 to month 3, this is how you're
Yeah.
going to feel.
I
And
read
then
that
from
book.
month 4 to month 6. And so, but with grieving, while I know that there's so many books and so many classes about the phases and stages of grief, Odell seemed to have put on herself a time frame. What do you do when you are working with people that want to have a time frame, like when am I going to be better? I know there's an acceptance stage, there's an anger stage, but there's no book out there to say what to expect when you've lost a child.
Exactly. Exactly. And most of the time when I have patients that are going through that and they're going, I don't know why I don't feel better. My response is, why do you feel you need to feel better at this time? Who told you
Told you
that?
that.
Who gave you this time frame? And they look at me like, well, you are healing, and I'm telling you you're healing because you're working toward it. You are here, you're working with me. This is part of the process. It's going to take however much time it takes. And some people might be going through this the rest of their lives in a
Mm-hmm.
process that
Yeah.
there is no time frame for any of it. It really isn't. I think that there's that saying that we are really our own worst enemy in this life. It's what we do to ourselves. We all did it though. Oh yeah, I need to go to college, I need to graduate in 4 years, I should have my job by now, I should have. What is going on? Why am I not making 80,000? I'm 30. you know so we always have these pressures, but that's what emotionally drains us. That's what basically kills us.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is this thing that we're trying to beat, and I don't understand where it came from.
I heard you say one time, and I wrote it down to remember it. You says
Mm-hmm.
that we are as sick as our secrets. So
Exactly.
we keep the secrets, we're going to get sick. So hopefully this is a healing. So Kathy, before we move forward, is was this did what happened to you when you had to deal with your daughter and autism? Did people treat you differently and expect you to adjust immediately to the situation?
I think I expected that of myself.
Okay.
So for
Yeah.
me, it was a little different in that when I found out about my daughter, I think my body and my mind immediately shut down, that I was just merely existing. That I don't remember. There was a period of time that as you said, you couldn't remember your son, looking at pictures. And while our stories are very different, our response sounds the same. That there was just a period of my life that I felt I was just merely existing.
Okay.
And not until we had to make a really important decision for our daughter at the age of 3 and have to put her in a school that I just, I broke down, and that was my prayer time. And I prayed for about I prayed and cried. I just released.
Mm,
And I don't remember when I woke up that morning, it was if that I had lost 20 pounds.
wow.
I could see the sun. I realized where I was. I wasn't just merely existing. I recognized me and the situation that I was in. And looking back, I had to say, what happened for these past 2 years? So it was kind of like an awakening for me.
Okay.
Mm,
It's people don't they still don't understand our tears, a
mm,
parent's tears, of the cries that we have. And it's been, as you talk about a process, I'm finally at a process, 4 years later, where I can laugh at some of the things that my son did. And
Mm-hmm.
I can now remember, why this is why I have this pain, because we had such joy and fun and laughter. And you remember, John, he was just funny.
yeah.
He was comical. So I can remember, I can now laugh at,
Yeah.
at some things that I couldn't laugh at before. So Kathy, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So here's my question for you. Tell us a daughter story about your
Oh
daughter.
yeah.
Give us a
Ah,
daughter
Well,
story.
so I'm going to want to hear from both of you.
uh-oh. Okay.
Something really funny and wonderful about each of your kids.
Okay. Odell, you go first, and then I'll go.
Oh, okay.
Look at her, she put
Uh,
it on you.
she
You can
always
remember.
she always does that. So okay, something funny. So in the production, when we were telling stories, there are great stories that I'm not going to talk about. I want you to see the production. One's about the red bandana, and then him meeting Tony Bennett. So
Oh,
that's in the production. So and you laugh just hearing about it.
Just here, I
I'm
cannot.
here. I'm laughing because I
I'm
remember who Tony Bennett is, and so
right.
I'm
I'm
aging
trying to
myself.
figure out how he knew.
Yes. So I will leave those stories for the production. But there is a story that I never forget. And being a single parent, I had challenges of raising teenagers. And at
Mhm.
some point, both my kids were taller than me. So they're in high school, and Coop didn't do something in the house. And I'm like, okay, leave all your technology on the table. I'm in charge. Leave it on the table. And, he brings out different things. And I said, and your cell phone. And he flexed and he looks at me and says, technically, Mom, he says, I paid for the cell phone, so I should
Uh,
keep it. And
mm-mm.
I'm like, you go, my money, I worked for it. You don't get my cell phone. And I'm like, okay, but mothers, we're not going out like that. And I wasn't going out like that. So I said, okay. And I could see my daughter looking at him like, dude, you're going to pay for that one. I don't know how, but you're going to pay for it. So I went upstairs and I'm processing how I'm going to win because mothers need to win. And I said, all right. I called the phone service and said, I can't find this phone. Can you please shut off the service? And I said, and I'll let you know when I find it. So the next morning, Saturday morning, I called Jackie. I called my daughter on her phone so he could hear her phone ringing. And I told her to call me so he could hear my phone ringing. So he comes out with his phone in his hand and he goes, Mom, something's wrong with my phone. You all's phone is working, but I don't have a dial tone. And I said, you may have paid for the phone, but I paid for the service. And was like, oh, he was like, you got me, And
Ooh,
as a
mommy
single
power.
as a single parent, I had to be creative in
That's
disciplining
right.
my children, and that was
That's
one of
right.
them.
That's right. I
So
love it. I
that's
love
my
it.
Love
that's
it.
my story.
Mommy power.
Mommy power,
Yeah.
yes. And you know what? And you're right, mommy power, because we always think that we have to make the decisions for our children, right? And
Right.
so for my story, our goal for our daughter was that her life would be as similar to her brother's as it possibly could be. They're about 2.5 years apart. And there was a point in her life where we were passing by the major high school in our city. And it's one mega high school in our city, which is really, really large. And up until that point, she was in contained classrooms. And kept riding by that high school and saying, Mommy, I want to go to that high school. And I'm like, that's a really big school. I don't think you want to go there. No, I do want to go, to the point where I stopped going by the school because I didn't want her to ask me about going to the school anymore. And I forgot one day and drove by the school again. And she's like, Mommy, I want to go to that school. And I said, oh my God. I said, why do you want to go to such a big school? She said, well, my brother went to a big high school. Why can't I go to a big high school?
Mm.
And so wanting to adhere to her wishes, because she should have a part and a say in her life. And so wanting to adhere to her wishes, my husband and I worked with the school to try and get her into the school. It's huge. And so I cried. I cried the first day of school. I cried every day. I cry all the time. And it's so the first day of school. Now, luckily, my husband had a Mason brother that worked in the school, and I was telling him, you better watch my baby and make sure nothing happens to her. And she was just fine. She walked in there like she had less of a care in the world. And so I was concerned because just her matriculating into some of the classes, although she was in contained, she still went to some of the other main classrooms. And she's one, you all know her. She's very social, and she's one that she loves her birthday. And here's my worry. She started in September, and then for her birthday, she kept saying, I told all my friends about my birthday. And I said, well, in high school, they don't really do parties like they did in the other school. So you might not get a party in this school, and I can't bring cupcakes. You can't kind of do that to high school. And why did she come home on the day of her birthday? And when I tell you, she had a grocery bag of gifts and
Oh,
cupcakes
Oh.
and
nice.
cookies. And so everybody in the school had brought her gifts. And so I learned to shut up. and and realized that this is something she wanted. She made it her own. Everybody knew her by the time she graduated the school and celebrated her birthday with her every single year. And so the joke was on me. So,
You
That's
know,
my kind of girl.
that's
yes.
Girl.
I wanted both my kids to go to that high school because it was big. I went
Yeah.
to a big high school, so I remember the football games and basketball
Yeah.
games, and I wanted them to have that experience. And my son looked at me and said, "You want me to get shot?" And I'm like, "Oh, jeez."
Oh.
Oh no.
So they both ended up going to a small school, a
Hmm.
smaller school.
Oh,
Now, Tam, you have a son, right?
oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
You talk about a mother's cry.
Oh yes.
you,
And it pretty much is you know, I think moms, we're that's it's a natural thing. They're going to bring us tears. My son is healthy and can go to college, went to college. He told me the other day, where this is his third year finishing, and he's like, I think I'm done with this. I was like, what? And heartbroken I was. But again, realizing that the pain of it was because it was my plan.
oh, say that again.
And it was my plan,
Okay.
and he's interrupting my plan, right? And it isn't about me, and
Mhm.
but it's still just as painful and hurt. I had him all set. He was going to college. He was gonna, graduate. He was gonna pledge a fraternity and get a good job and get a condo. And how dare you? What
Kathy, does this sound like our last week podcast?
It sounds exactly like our last week podcast. It does. Odell shared how we both have very common upbringings, and
yeah.
they had a plan for us, and we weren't supposed to veer from that plan or our life, but we weren't prepared for anything to interrupt what we already had planned. And that
That's
was
right.
the tragedy of it. And when Odell talked to me about being her partner on the podcast and telling me what it was going to be about, and I said, Odell, my story is very different than yours. Yours was such a tragedy. She said, but you still had a loss. You
Yeah.
in your mind wanted a daughter who you knew would get married and have grandchildren for you, and that got interrupted. And
Yeah.
so loss is loss. Have you seen that, Tam? Have you dealt with that before? A loss is a loss. I mean, is there levels of loss, or is it just loss?
Well, hold on before you answer that question, Tam. So,
Uh-huh.
when your son said he wasn't going back to college, what did you tell him? Honestly, what
Well,
did you tell him?
honestly, how could you do this to me? How could you do this to me?
I love
And
it.
you know what? If you're not gonna do what I want you to do, then you need to come home. And he's like, "What are you talking like?" Because Kathy mentioned earlier the book, What to Expect When Expecting. Unfortunately, I think it stopped at like toddler age. Where's the book for 18, 19,
That's
20?
right.
So yeah. As far as loss, loss is really just grief, kind of just combined grief. And you got to remember, it's the process of grieving for
Hmm.
your
Hmm.
loss, Odell's loss, people who've had beautiful homes and lost their job and now living on, that's grief. So
Hmm.
it's going to be just as painful. um because it wasn't the plan. It really wasn't the plan.
You're right, and I'm sure you're seeing a lot of it with COVID.
Oh, yeah.
Um, I had to explain to a few people that I was submitting my grant for that, and the question was, is interruption related to COVID? It's like, yes,
Yes.
you
Yes.
know, it's another
Mhm.
layer of trauma.
Exactly.
We're still dealing with job loss, grief,
Yes.
because we can't resume the life that we used to have. Life is going to look very different when we can finally reemerge back into society. And grief is grief. And on top of everything else that someone's going through, grief, death, job loss, and
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
people are, I'm sure you're seeing it. They're drinking more. They've
Of
increased on their addiction because there's no outlet. They're living with their abusers because there's no
yes.
outlet. Some women was like, "Oh, I can't wait for my husband to leave because
Mm.
now I have space to breathe." And he's not leaving the house, or
Yeah.
the children are now witnessing and seeing the stress, the arguments, the trauma in the house, and there's no outlet.
Exactly.
So this COVID has been another layer of stress. And I'm sure, do you all get extra funding for this, Tim?
No extra funding. We have had the privilege, though, of trying to redesign our program, though, that
Okay.
we can go, they can't come to us. So we've done all kind of telehealth services where, on Zoom and My Charts, and we're
Uh,
doing everything to try to reach people. And you're absolutely right. Because this right here, was not planned and no one was prepared, and no one there people, and grief is that you go through all those stages, that anger,
yes.
that guilt, that all that stuff of how could I have done something different
Yes.
to make this better for myself.
Yeah,
So
in the midst of planning interruptions, Kathy was a part of this. It was going to be a stage production,
Mhm.
and we were
oh
going
yeah.
to have it at Bergamo's Theater. August 28th and 29th was the weekend we had planned. That last weekend in August, stage production. And I had my mindset, I was planning for that. Then COVID happened,
Mm.
and no, and grants were denied, and because people needed food, they needed money for rent and shelter, so there were other emergencies other than a stage production coming in August. And then I was allowed to resubmit my grants, but they're like, we can't now there's no theater, so we can't have
Mm,
theater. So it was interrupted again, and I'm talking to Kathy. I'm like, interruptions has been interrupted. So I'm praying, knowing that this is something that God wanted us to do, and it's how do you do this? So I had to learn how to deliver this platform online and reinvent again and again. And then how to find cast. Nobody's around. Colleges
Mm.
are closed. Jobs have closed. How do you reach people? There's no one to go to in churches because they're closed.
right.
So trying to network to find cast was even more challenging. So interruption, talk about crying. I'm like, I can't believe this. And I remember people saying, well, I guess you're not going to do it. And I'm like, no, I'm moving forward. This
That's
is,
right.
I believe this is a timely message, a godly message. And then it was, well, you can't talk about gun violence. And then the interruption happened where I was asked to downplay the gun violence and just talk about trauma. Don't call it urban trauma. And then Black Lives Matter happened. And now they're like, okay, talk about gun violence, talk about urban
No,
trauma. So it's all I know is to be true to the story, be
that's
true to
right.
my story,
It is your
and
story.
my story is a story of gun violence, urban trauma, mental health, stereotypes, stigmas that we have in our community, and being able to have a network of support. But Kathy, I have a question for you. This question did not come
Uh-oh.
through, it did not come through any chats. I'm not going to tell you that lie.
Ah.
So I do have one for you. We talk about interruptions. You mentioned in church one Sunday that you were diagnosed with MS.
Mm.
Mhm.
And my heart just was just like, oh my goodness, my friend. That's an interruption. But like you look good on the outside. So talk to us about what's going on the inside with you and how are you dealing with that?
Well, thank you for asking. I believe that as you have to share your story. And for me, when I initially heard it, I think there were tears because I wasn't expecting it and didn't know which way to turn. Since the onset of the MS and the initial doctor, I have since switched to a better doctor. So one that is really taking really good care of me. So I've learned to live with it, but it's not something that I feel like I'm existing with. It's different for me because after having the diagnosis of my daughter having autism, I felt like if I could face that, then anything that came after that for me was not going to be as hard of a trial. When I lost both of my parents, I feel that God had set up my life for me to have a child that had difficulties and illnesses so that it would better prepare me to deal with the loss of both of my parents 9 months apart. I don't think if I had not had dealt with my daughter being ill, that I would not have been able to deal with the loss of my parents. I would not have been that strong. And so now going through that process and then the onset of the MS, honestly, it just felt like, okay, here's another one. I got it, but I had other people that needed me, and let me have my cry, but I need to keep moving. I needed to just keep moving.
Right, right. Wow.
Is that
Wow.
normal, Tam?
Oh yes, definite. You know, just in case I don't get to say that I just want to thank you both for having me join
Oh.
you both today. It was an honor and a privilege. Um, I just want to commend both of you for sharing your stories. It can be it could be so empowering and inspirational to hear how such resiliency can 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 happen. You all are just like, oh my God, like it is amazing. And you don't
Yeah.
know this, but how your stories are going to be an inspiration for other people who are stuck and feeling hopeless.
Mm,
Yeah.
Because if I hear your story, I go, oh my God, look how she's doing this. It will
mhm.
make me feel
Grace.
better. It will make
Grace.
someone feel better. So powerful. It is powerful. And that's how we heal. We tell our stories, we move and we keep functioning. In our IOP program, I tell my patients all the time, I can't heal you in 4 to 6 weeks because that's all I get. I'm not going to completely heal you. It is
Mm,
not enough time. But my
Okay.
job is to give you skills, to give you some type of skills to build on that will help you with those distressed moods and that dysregulation, enough to get up, enough to
Good.
take your shower, enough to eat, enough to function and keep moving. That's my
Mhm.
job. And
And
you all
that's
are doing it excellently.
where, the grace of, I always say the grace of God. I was asked to teach a class last year, University of Bridgeport, and the class was Authentic Happiness. And I was reading a book by Martin Seligman, and he talked about, the book is called Authentic Happiness. And the person that taught the class prior was a PhD in counseling and psychology. And I'm reading over her notes. She had theories and concepts, and I'm recovering from a brain aneurysm. So I couldn't, I'm like, I don't know this. I can't learn this and teach this. So I tried to find a way to teach this class to adult learners that was relevant for me. And as I was talking to them, I said, in this book, it talks about, as adults, we have life experiences from our faith, our family, our network, our upbringing, that something that we've learned in our past, we've experienced, that will help get us through hard times.
That's right.
And
Mhm.
as I was teaching it, I said, I want to be able to help you deal with interruptions in your life. And when I said that, that's when I knew, that's how I came up with the name of this production, Interruptions. And I called the director and I said,
Mhm.
I know you said we can't name the production till later. She was like, here she go, here goes this rookie. And I said, it's called Interruptions.
Mhm.
And they liked it. And Kathy, what you talked about is that you had already gone through some grief and trauma in your life that was
Mhm.
challenging, and it prepared you.
Yeah.
And you knew
Yeah.
how to deal with something which it'd be huge for others, but
Mhm.
minor for you.
Now, Tim, I know that you watched the first two productions. There was a young lady that played Odell's daughter in the first one, and she was
Mhm.
phenomenal. And she talked about having a meeting with her daughter, which I know her daughter well. But I wish you could meet her. She is wonderful. Now, what do you, in terms of her daughter? What do you what would you expect? I mean, she had lost her brother, and then all of a sudden, a year later, her mother's going through an aneurysm.
Ooh, you know, I heard Odell talk about her daughter at one point having to tell all the stories about her son and giving her the memories. And then you actually, Kathy, mentioned your son. And I was wondering how both your kids handled Odell, your daughter handling the loss of her brother, and Kathy, how did your son handle having a younger sister who is autistic, and how did they heal, or are
Mm-hmm.
they still healing?
Well, I'll go for me. My daughter is still healing, and as she says, that was her brother. And in the production, I tell the story that when my daughter was born, she was annoying, and she needed somebody to be with. So we had another child. So my son was born for her. So as she says, they could have bought me a dog, but they gave, they gave me a brother, and she took care of her brother. She loved her brother. They were just that close. So
Yeah.
she's still healing. She's still going through it,
And
and she
then
has,
she had you get sick.
yes,
That
yes.
had to be scary and frustrating.
Still is. She still plays the mother role. I have to tell her to back up. And she wouldn't even let me do this podcast unless I had a host. She said, you can't do it alone.
So she's the mother.
I was just getting ready to say that. we do. We flip these roles, right? And now all of a sudden she's the mother telling
She's the
you,
mother.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And how's your son?
Yeah. So for me, I share with you that I lost track of time in terms of really not recognizing 2 years of my life when my daughter was initially diagnosed, and I thought about it one day, and I said, "Oh my God, my son! What have I done to him over these past 2 years?" So we've since then we've had very honest conversations, and although he was young, I spoke to him at a way that he would understand that mommy doesn't mean to ignore you. I know your sister has a lot of attention coming into the house every day, but if you ever feel like I'm not paying attention to you, you pull
Yeah,
me aside and say, I need to talk to you, or I need you, mommy, or I need attention. So we've learned to have different types of conversations with him, but I feel he has a sense of loss because it's not, his sister is not the one that he can teach to drive, or he can't take her and hang out and go out to a, they can go to a movie, but it's not that normal sister, although she adores him. It's not that he feels that loss of not having that normal brother sister relationship. So
yeah,
I know he has that sense of loss.
I can imagine. Jackie says to me now, I wasn't meant to be the only child.
mm,
I wasn't meant to, because now it's who's going to clean the gutters, who's cutting the grass. And she's like, nope. So we have our challenges, and I understand your son, the normalcy. This is a, as I say, a new normal, a different normal for all of us.
yes,
Mhm.
right. That's right. You talked about that earlier too, when you were like, why don't I feel better? Why can't I feel better? That's exactly what happens in depression. It starts to feel normal. This is the new you, and it's hard to get through.
Yes.
Um, Having a good day doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel normal.
Well,
Hmm.
I don't know what a new good day is, but it's I work on them. So,
Yeah.
Tim, we thank you for coming on
Oh,
board and joining us today. We have a whole segment talking about um, PTSD and stress and addictions, and we actually titled it "Who Wants to Talk About That?" But we have a nice segment that we're going to address that piece with. But we are running close to time,
Yes.
and
oh,
next, I
already?
know.
Already, I know.
Next week, we have a very interesting conversation, Kathy. We have
Yes.
a member from Connect who's on the Connect team with me. He's the lawyer, Phil Kent, who represented us in court to shut down Slice Pizza Bar, and the detective who was assigned to my son's case, who gave us some of the information, who gave us
Mhm.
all the information we needed to help change that Hamden community when I decided that I wanted to shut down Slice to prevent another mother from waking up the way that I did. Um,
Mm,
and that was our challenge. And, so often we become immune to black on black crimes. And I had become immune to it, except for this time I said no more. It's time to do something different. So next week, they are our guest. And I'll say it here and we'll say it again. This does not mean that Kathy and I do not support Black Lives Matter. We,
No.
we do support Black Lives Matter. We believe in systemic racism. We do support and understand police brutality. It's just that we're having a different conversation next week of partnership, community
Mhm.
partnership with Hamden Mayor, Hamden Police, and the community to shut down a facility that was toxic in the Hamden area.
mm.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And we will also be responding to questions that come into our podcast. So please continue to send in the questions. I am looking forward to next week. And again, I share Odell with you and thanking Tam for coming on. And
Thank you again.
I guess I'm supposed to say thank you, Soroy Tam.
oh
That's
no, I
right.
don't think that was in the script.
Thank you, Soroy.
No, I don't remember us discussing that.
Tam, you see my background?
I see. I love it. Look, I'm about to do a little oop or something over here.
Okay.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. And Odell, as I always say, we do these podcasts because we understand interruptions. And if you want to make God laugh, just tell him what you have planned.
Absolutely.
Love it.
And my closing is no matter how dark the clouds may seem in your life, when you rise above them, the sun is always shining. Thank you. Look forward to seeing everybody next week. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.